Welcome back to Cooking with Love. I'm your chef host, Linda Verasso, the owner of Peppercorns on Main and Route 18 in South Weymouth. And behind the camera we have Fred Hickson, who is the man behind this idea. And I'll continue to thank him every show because I think it was a great one and I look forward to doing more of them. In this show, we are going to do something I think is perfect for wintertime, and that's soups. We have two of my favorite soups we're going to do today. They're very traditional, they're very rustic, and we're going to make sure that by the end of this show, you know exactly how to make these as well. The two soups today are the traditional Italian wedding soup and a minestrone. And clearly, you can tell just from the names and from what you know, these are soups that should be in everybody's repertoire. So as we go through the show, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ingredients and the folklore behind it. And you'll potentially be able to impress your friends with some of the new knowledge that we impart on you today. But we're going to get started. First thing is the Italian wedding soup. Going to put in our mirepoix, and our mirepoix, as you may know, is simply a combination of celery, carrots, and onions. We're going to put that in with our broth, etc., and some seasonings. Once that's all together, we let that cook up for probably 30-40 minutes. While that's cooking, we do step two. And step two is what I refer to as prepping the fillings to the soup. Now, you don't often think about a soup having fillings, but in this case, I couldn't come up with a better word, so that's what we're going to call them. And the fillings in the Italian wedding soup are probably the key ingredients. One is the greens, and you can use chicory or escarole or even spinach. You can use a number of different kinds of greens. The real key is that it be greens. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between those shortly. And the second filling is the mini meatballs. Now, you've probably all had this soup, and this is really where the love comes in this soup, because making these tiny little meatballs can take some time. So we'll make the meatballs, and I'll show you how we do that. And then the third filling, really which kind of brings it all together, marries them if you will, is a combination of cheese and eggs. And as the soup is finally boiling in the end and finishing up, we will add that in slowly. And again, we'll show you how to do it. Kind of gives it that egg drop kind of wispy ingredient inside the soup, filling inside the soup. And what I call creates that marriage for this Italian wedding soup. So let's get started. Forgive me, I need my glasses every once in a while. I want to make sure I go right through the recipe that you're going to see on your screen. The Italian wedding soup really doesn't have a ton of ingredients, but it does require some effort, like I mentioned a few moments ago with the meatballs, etc. But to get started, it's very simple. Get a nice soup pan. Now, the soup pan doesn't have to be a real heavy bottom. It can be a thinner bottom. That's usually what a stock or a soup pan is. This one is kind of an in-between. It's got a heavier bottom. I prefer that. But if you have just a regular saucepan at home, that'll work fine. So first thing, we're going to turn our heat on here. I think we got it on. Yep. You're going to get a pan a little warm there. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of oil. I think it calls for a couple tablespoons of oil. And I'm just going to cover the bottom of the pan. I'm using an olive oil here. It's kind of a light olive oil. Since we're not frying anything for a long time, that works fine. If we were frying some veggies for quite a while, then you'd want to use a lighter oil, because the lighter your oil, the more heat it can take, and the less chance you have of burning that oil and getting that flavor in your soup, which clearly you don't want. So we got our oil in. Now we're going to add our vegetables. We're going to add a couple of cups of chopped onion. And you can see it's not a huge chop. It is enough that you can get a few of them on a spoon. We're going to add that in. We can hear that sizzling up. Just give that a little bit of a toss. To that, we're also going to add the rest of what I referred to a few moments ago as the mirepoix, which is a couple of cups of the carrots and the celery. So that's going right in. that. Of course, you can't have an Italian anything, I don't think, without garlic, so we got to get that in there. If you were here, you would smell what that just did to this room. It's pretty amazing how quickly the flavor and the smell of that garlic comes right out. So tossing that right around. And you know, you don't have to let this go for very long. We're just going to let it go for a couple of moments here. We're going to add a little bit of parsley here. I'm using dried parsley. I believe I spoke to you in one other show, if you've watched any of the others, about dried versus fresh herbs. Since we are going to be cooking this for a period of time, right in with the soup, the dried works better. They're more concentrated. They don't lose their flavor from the cooking. So that's why we're using the dried parsley here. You could use fresh, however. If you want to use fresh, then you need to wait till towards the very end of the finishing touches and add it in at that time. Okay? So we've got our vegetables in there. We've got our garlic, our parsley. Let's give it just a little bit of fresh pepper. And this is, like everything else, a preference. You like a lot of pepper? Go for it. If you're allergic to it, obviously keep it out. There's all kinds of ways you can do it. The beautiful thing is there's really no wrong way to make just about any soups, which is one of the reasons why I enjoy making them so much. And we're going to add just a touch of salt here. And the reason I'm only adding a little bit is because the chicken stock, or the chicken base, whichever you're going to use, stock or broth, we'll have it in there. So you don't want to kill it. I just wanted to get a little directly on the vegetables, so it helps that process of flavoring the vegetables come out. But there are many different types of stock you can use. And we're all familiar, of course, with the bouillon cubes. What you might not be familiar with is something that's called a base. And I'm going to show you what that looks like here. This is something you can actually get in a number of stores now. Certainly I've seen it at the local Stop and Shops and BJ's. It is much more of a paste. And as you can tell just from me scooping it out here, it is a paste. It looks like chicken because the first ingredient, in fact, is chicken. And that's really the difference between using something like this and using a bouillon cube. So I hope you can all repeat after me at home. I promise I will never use a bouillon cube again. And trust me, if you make that promise to yourself and to everybody you love who you cook for, you'll just be so happy because the taste is significantly different. Bouillon cubes are very much salt. Bases like this are much better. Of course, you can't beat a homemade stock, but when you don't have that, this works very well. And you can tell from the color of it here, it really is a rich one, and we're going to use the base today for our soup. So 4 quarts, I believe, is what the recipe calls for. This will make a little over a gallon of soup. We have already mixed our base in with it, some warm water. We're going to just simply take this and pour it right in. Now you may not realize, let me get that in so it quiets down and you're going to hear me, may not realize there's actually a difference between, actually let me get a little bit of that goodness out of here from the base. There's actually a difference between stock and broth. And the way I remember it is that a stock, or a stock yard, has the animals in it. And a stock is something that you get after you boil meat and bones. It has to have the bones in it. That's what will give you that very rich, and you know how you've probably all made a stock before, where you put it in the refrigerator after you've done it and you take it out and it's like a jello. The only reason it can get that way is because of the bones you use. And the gelatin type chemical or ingredient is in those bones, and without them you would never get that. It is what makes it very rich. If you boil just meat, doesn't matter how how long you boil that for and how long you refrigerate it. It will never gel like that. It will still be delicious, but it won't be quite as rich. So that's the difference. We're using a broth here today because we used a base. And that'll be just as wonderful for this soup today, given all the other flavors that are in it. All right, our base is done. All we're going to do is let that go for about, I think it's about 40 minutes I put in the recipe. We might stir it every once in a while. But what we are now going to focus on is what I call the fillings. And this is where we do 3 different things. I mentioned before the meatballs, the greens, and then the egg and cheese mixture. So actually, let me start out easy. We'll start with the eggs, and we'll put them aside. In this bowl, I have 3 eggs, and there's about a ½ cup of Romano cheese. All I'm going to do is give them a little toss, add that cheese right in, and mix it all up here, and then we're going to just set it aside until we're ready for it. We'll be ready for this when the soup is nearly done. And this is pretty much the very last thing you're going to add to it. So that's all. It just gets to kind of be a thick egg mixture because of the cheese. It's no more difficult than that. All right, we're going to just put that right over here until we're ready for it. The next thing we're going to do is the greens. Now, I mentioned in the beginning of the show there are several different types of greens you can use. We're going to use both chicory and escarole. Now, you've probably all heard of this soup referred to as escarole soup, and that is because often the escarole is what was used in it. As the escarole is, let me show you what escarole looks like. This is a bunch of escarole here. And a very, large leaves. It's actually a little bitter. This is not something you would necessarily put right into a salad. Some of the younger leaves or more tender leaves you could, but it is a little bitter, so you don't usually find this as an ingredient in salad. All we're going to do here is over on this side I have another pan. It's just got about 1 inch of water in it. And I'm going to put that on and get that up to a little bit of a boil. And we're essentially going to steam the escarole here and the chicory. So here's your escarole, put that aside for a moment, and here's chicory. Now you might think, my God, that's a lot of stuff. And it looks like it, but the truth of the matter is after we cook it, it'll be a very small amount. And this here, each of these actually weighs about 1 pound. And your recipe calls for 1 to 2 pounds of greens. And so we could see both types. I in fact bought both. Chicory tends to be very dirty. So when you do buy this, do spend a good deal of time putting it in a bowl like this or a big pan and really kind of rinse it out with the water. I've already done that, but you really just want to kind of shake it out, rinse the water a few times before you actually use it, or you'll end up with a little grit of sand in your soup, and obviously nobody wants that. All we're going to do with this, now that we have it nice and clean, we're going to just kind of do a little bit of a rough chop through it. You can take the stem off. I personally like to leave it on because it helps keep everything together. So I'm just taking it, and I believe I've probably told you about how to handle a knife before, but just in case, the right way to hold a knife is not like this. It's with your fingers, your index finger right on that side of the blade and your thumb holding that one right up close. It might be a little uncomfortable at first, but if you make yourself do it, it is much easier, you have much more control, and it's much safer. So let's go ahead. We're going to give it a little bit of a rough chop. All right, we'll get rid of that piece. That's got a little brown on it. We'll move that and kind of move it around. I hold the tip of the knife down on the table. Again, it's a safety thing, and it also makes it easier to just kind of do a cross cut, especially when you're dealing with something this voluminous or a lot. There's a great word there. I just can't ever say it right. All right, so once that's all chopped up, this water I had heating a little while ago, so it is actually doing a nice little simmery boil kind of thing. I'm actually going to throw this right in here. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing to my chicory. The difference with chicory, however, is that the leaves are already quite thin, so I don't need that cross cut. So I'm just going to take this and squish it all together. Maybe about an inch, inch and a half pieces. You know, it's really just about ease of eating. You don't want to create these big old leaves that kind of drape over your spoon. You want to be able to get a nice cut of whatever green you're using onto your spoon without slurping it all over the place. So that goes right in there. I'm going to give that a quick little stir. How's my soup doing? That's still going strong there. And you saw how much stuff we put in there. I'm actually going to take my bowl. I'm just going to put right on top there. I'm one of those people who believes that the less dishes I have to do at the end of the day, the better off I am. So if I already got one dirty, I'm going to use it for everything I can. So we're going to let that cook for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to kind of come over here and just give this a stir. And then I'm going to show you about the meatballs. All right, as you can tell, I've cheated here. I've already actually rolled several of them. And one of the things that's true about this soup, I would say, is that its signature is these mini meatballs. I'm not going to show you how to make the meatball mix. I've actually showed you that in our very first episode. You can always go back to one of the other episodes and get the ingredients for that. For a soup this, about amount of soup this is, you need about 2 cups of these little meatballs after they're cooked. This takes about a ½ pound of hamburger. So if you take the recipe from before, you kind of scale it down to about a ½ pound of hamburger, then you'll have plenty of what you need for this soup. Some people also like to add shredded chicken. If you don't have meatballs, or even with meatballs, people will add shredded chicken to it. Some people even add a little bit of sausage. You can find it all over the place with different ingredients. But traditionally, it's these little mini meatballs that you're going to find. And the way that you make them, you make your meatball mix. Here's a little bit more that I would just want to show you how we're going to roll them. You just take a very small amount, really the size of a dime almost. So just a tiny little bit, and you're just going to roll that around. Now you don't have to go too crazy because it's so small it tightens up pretty well, but you don't want them much bigger than this. And that's, as I said, that's a lot of love to make all of these little meatballs. And I know as we were growing up, and when my mother was making escarole soup, because we used to call it escarole, even though, by the way, we never put escarole in it, it was always chicory, but that's beside the point. We would have to roll these for her, and she wanted them so small. It was really a pain in the neck. Mine are probably too big for her, but since she's not here right now, I'm going to get away with it. So we have some little meatballs. Let me just roll up a couple more of these. So you just grab a little chunk. I don't even know what that's the same, maybe the size of a marble, I guess is a good way to put that. Just a little chunk, just roll them up and get them ready to cook. At this point, for the meatballs, we will put them in a little, I don't want to cook them directly in the soup. Many people will do that. Many people will put them right in the soup at this point. It's okay. The reason why I don't do that is because the fat that is in the hamburger is all released in the soup. And I don't need that much in the soup. While fat definitely has flavor, we've got other flavors we'd like to highlight in that soup as well. So what we do instead, and when I say we, I mean my mother, is she will take a little pan, boiling water, and we're going to cook them right inside of that boiling water. So let me just take a quick moment, finish up rolling these few last little meatballs, and then I'm going to set up this pan over here that has the greens in it, which actually, one second, let me check that for us. I'm going going to move that aside. Those greens are pretty much done. These greens have all just wilted down. That's really all you're looking for. So it's not anything very difficult. Those are all wilted down. What I'm going to do now is take a couple moments. I'm going to shut this off. I'm going to bring this in the back and drain it, which you'll want to do. Finish rolling these few meatballs, and then I'll show you how we cook the meatballs. And then in a few moments after that, we're going to marry this soup with all of the different ingredients we have. So I have gone ahead and I took out the pan and drained it that had all our greens in it. And as you can tell from looking at this, this is what I ended up with. So you really do need a pound or two of greens to make enough for a pot of soup that big. And this is what you're going to end up with. It's not a ton, but it's perfect for what you are going to end up with here. So we're going to put those greens aside. They're all drained and ready to go. And as I told you, the way that we do the meatballs here is by boiling them in a pan separately, so all the fat kind of gets off of them, and by the time I get them in the soup, I'm just going to be able to enjoy the meat. I have gone ahead and finished rolling the extra little bits of meat, and now all I'm going to do, I have a little skillet here. I find a skillet easier because it's shallow. We got a slotted spoon. I'm going to throw them in here, 30 seconds maybe. And then scoop them right back on out. I'm going to put them aside in this same pan, and then we're going to actually perform the wetting and marry the base with the fillings and finish it off with the egg, which I have moved over here. Okay? So let's throw these meatballs in. Just be gentle with them. You don't want to ruin all your hard work of rolling these little marbles. So those all go in there. Again, it was about a half a pound of meat. We'll get rid of the base. Not too bad at all, just fills that little skillet. And just let that sit for a few moments. We'll give the soup a stir, which is boiling nicely. It has a wonderful color to it. And once we add the greens and the meatballs and the eggs, we'll be done. And all that will be left is to taste it. Okay, so these are probably pretty much done right here. You can tell from looking at the water, they've released some of that fat. They're pretty much cooked. You're not spending a lot of time on it. It's just like I said, just a little boiling water. We're just going to put them right back in to our pan to hold. As I mentioned, I think the recipe calls for 2 cups of meatballs. Honestly, this is probably 2 cups. It might be a little more, it might be a little less. No worries, just use what you got. If you got some extra burger and you want to put it in, I don't think anybody's going to be upset if they get more meatballs in their soup than they're used to. All right, let's shut that off. We have filling number 1, filling number 2. We'll call this the marriage maker right there. And now we're going to come over to our soup. We are going to add the greens right to the soup. Careful it doesn't splash at you. Going to give that a mix around. Okay. Then we're going to go ahead and add our meatballs to the soup. Give that a mix around. And then we're going to let that just come back up to a boil here. Let me put it on a little higher. It won't take more than a few seconds. Remember that we had our egg mixture we made a little while ago, which is simply eggs and some grated cheese. I used Romano. You can use Parmesan if you prefer. The important thing is that it be a grated cheese, not a shredded cheese. The purpose of the cheese is it helps make the wisps of the eggs, and of course is going to impart a great deal of flavor into the soup. From that cheese. We've got a half a cup of cheese in a container like this. You know you're going to taste that. And that really is what finishes it off. So actually, before I add this egg, I'm going to take the moment while it's taking about 30 seconds to get back up to temp, and I'm going to give you a little bit of history on the Italian wedding soup. And again, I'll need my glasses for this one. But the term wedding soup is a mistranslation of the Italian language minestra maritata, which means married soup, which is a reference to the fact that green vegetables, the escarole, the chicory, go really well with meat. So it's about the marriage of the meat and the greens. Has nothing to do with weddings. You might get it at a wedding, but it really has nothing to do. It's not a traditional soup they served at weddings. That is all kind of stories people made up, I guess, along the way. But an Italian wedding soup is about the marriage of the meats and the greens. It's extremely old, as I mentioned at the front end of the show. It's one of the very oldest soups that there is recipes written down for. It falls into a group of meat and vegetable soups that are common throughout Europe, and probably has a Roman origin. It was the standard Neapolitan fare before the introduction of pasta. So much so that people from other regions used to call the Neapolitans leaf eaters, or I'm going to say it wrong, so I'm not even going to try it, but leaf eaters is what it meant, because they always ate these greens in their soup. It was designed to be a filling single-course meal. That's why you will find the meatballs in it, you will find chicken in it, you will find sausage in it, whatever it was. It was supposed to be a very hearty soup, because oftentimes this was the only meal of the day for quite a few folks. And as most soups, there's, as I mentioned, also an infinite number of variations you can make. If you like some of these things, great, throw them in. If you don't like some, change it up. You know, as I said, for greens, you can use spinach. You can use radicchio, which is actually not necessarily green. You can use frisee. You can use all kinds of stuff that is green that you like. So that's where the whole Italian wedding soup name came from. Don't think you're going to find it at your next Italian wedding, although you very well may. All right, this is up to a nice boil. Now that you know everything I know about Italian wedding soup folklore, let's go ahead and drip this in. Now, this is one of those things that you want to go slowly. I'm going to show you how we do it. I'm going to take and stir the soup as it drips in. We don't want huge clumps of egg, so we're going to stir it as we go along. Because it hits that boiling water, boiling water, as you probably know, is 212 degrees. Eggs cook at about 145, so as soon as it hits that boiling water, we're good. And I know we're going to show you a close-up of what this looks like in the pan. And in doing so, you'll see all that goodness and how everything just comes right together with that addition of those eggs. It coats some of the greens. It certainly gets through to the meatballs and makes the broth a very, very hearty one. So I'm going to let that sit here for just one moment. I'm going to let you take a peek at what that looks like. And I'm going to go grab a bowl so we can give this a shot. So there's only one thing left to do, of course, and that's to try the soup. And we have, I've just turned it off. It is still extremely hot, so I'm going to go easy here. But what I'm going to do is just take a ladle. We used to make sure we got meatballs in our ladle. Let's pour some of that in there, just a touch. And at this point, you can garnish with some Parmesan cheese, some shredded Parmesan cheese. Just some grated cheese is great. Certainly, serving it with a nice big loaf of bread is always a good idea. But truly, as you can tell from the quick effort that we put into this here, it's not a hard thing to do. The hardest thing to do for most cooking is just taking the time to chop your vegetables and to measure your ingredients. But I tell you what, if you do that ahead of time, and then when you have all your ingredients ready, just throw it all together, cooking is one of the simplest things you can do. It also helps if you have somebody who will clean up after you, which luckily I do here. I know you probably don't at home. So. All right, so we have a little here, we got some meatballs, we just got a little bit of the greens, we got a little of the carrot, the onion, celery, all here on my little spoon. Give that a little blow because it is a very hot. That's great. The veggies still have just a tiny bit of crunch to them. As it cooks longer, of course, that'll go away, but I kind of like it. And the greens and the egg all really blend so well together. So there you have it. We have now made Italian wedding soup, aka escarole soup, and in a very short period of time you can go home and do the same thing. And don't forget, just like everything else, do it with love. You want some of this, Fred? It's awesome. And the second soup we're going to do today is autumn minestrone. Now, I mentioned a minestrone soup in the beginning of the show that we were going to do, and we are, in fact, doing that. The reason why I call my recipe autumn minestrone is because I put butternut squash in it, and I think it brings a really nice sweetness to it that you might not expect, and so that's why I call mine an autumn minestrone. So the recipe that you'll see has a couple cups of butternut squash peeled and chopped in it, and it really makes a huge difference, I think. So to do this, this is actually more of a two-step process. We have the base we're going to make, which is where we have our veggies. We're cooking all our veggies, etc. And then after that, the finishing touches is what I'm going to call it. And really the finishing touches in this case is some pasta. And then serving it, of course, by finishing it off with a little Parmesan or Romano cheese, whatever you prefer. And of course, you need bread for this. This is almost more of a stew than it is a soup. But you can eat it however you want, as a first course, as a main course. But key, of course, is have some good bread to dip into it. So we're going to get started. Start with the pan. We have a new saucepan here. As I mentioned before, it's got a decent bottom, but this particular one is actually a little thinner than the other one. And that's perfectly okay because we're boiling a very thin liquid. If we're making a cream soup, I'd probably opt for a thicker bottom. Since we're not making a cream soup, we're going to go with what we got. All right, glasses on. We're going to start like we usually do with a little bit of oil. Again, there's some olive oil in here, only a couple tablespoons. Basically, I'm just trying to coat the bottom of the pan to allow our veggies to cook in it. And to that, as your recipe will tell you, we're going to add a little garlic. So the garlic's in there, and actually let's give it a little stir here. And to that now we're going to add our celery and our onion. These are a very fine chop. And really the way that I think about it when I'm preparing veggies for something like a minestrone is you want to get one of each on your spoon every time you go in. So clearly they got to be small. So put that in, the onion and the celery, the garlic, they only need to cook up for about 4 or 5 minutes to start to get them tender. I'm actually going to rush it just a little bit here and show you what else we're going to add to it. After these cook for just a few moments, we are going to add our carrots, which we have in here, our mushrooms, which are also chopped, and our butternut squash. We've got about 2 cups of butternut squash. The butternut squash you want to cut just a little bigger than your veggies, and the reason for that is that this tends to melt. You've all had butternut squash before, and you know as it cooks it kind of fades away, if you will, or becomes very soft. So I like to make them a little bigger so that as they melt into the soup, you still have a little bit of a chunk that comes together when you grab a spoon. So We're going to stir these in. We're going to add our carrots, mushrooms. I tell you what, the hardest thing about this soup is that you got a lot of chopping to do, and that you've got several different ingredients, and that is really the hardest thing. Creating it and putting it all together is no problem at all. We're going to add the squash to that. And you probably at home, when you cook squash, just boil it anyway, so you get the idea of why you want to make that a little bigger. So we got a wonderful pan full of veggies here. Let me follow the recipe so I tell you exactly what you're going to do next. So again, we're just going to saute that up a few more minutes. At this point, I'm going to add the chopped tomatoes. There are a couple of things you can do as the tomatoes go. You can do this and add about 1.5 cups of chopped tomato, plus a little bit of sauce, about 1 cup of sauce, or if you choose, if you have a can of whole peeled tomatoes, a 28-ounce can of whole peeled tomatoes, you can reserve the juice from that, chop up those tomatoes, and use those. Either way will work. If you don't have a can of tomatoes, use fresh. If you have fresh, if you don't have fresh and you have a can, use that. Either way, it's fine. Just get some sort of tomato in there. So, in comes the tomatoes as well. And tell, if you looked at this pan here, I'm going to tilt it towards the camera. Maybe we can get a little zoom in. This is a pan pretty much full of veggies. And clearly that's what a minestrone is. And now we're going to add all of our stocks. Now in our last soup we did all chicken. Many minestrones are all beef. Personally, I think all beef is too heavy, all chicken is too light. So I do both. And I do a half and half. I have half chicken stock. There's 1 quart of chicken stock here, 4 cups. And put that right in. Quiet that down. And I have another quart that's beef. And I'm going to put that right in there. Let's get these out of the way. In the recipe, it also tells us at this point to add a bay leaf, which we'll talk about a little while. We have some dried basil and dried parsley, and as I mentioned a few moments ago, well, again, we're going to use dried spices in this because it is going to cook for a period of time. We're going to add a little bit of salt. Again, not too heavy since the stock does have it. Some fresh pepper. Oh. And what I consider to be the secret ingredient to this soup is Worcestershire sauce. Worcestershire sauce is a great combination of flavors, and we add about 1 tablespoon right to the soup, which gives it that little flavor that people can't quite understand but know is there and love. And if you ever give somebody the recipe, leave out the Worcestershire sauce and they'll never make it as good as you do. I'm not like that though. All right, so at this point we would let it, I think we got all our ingredients in there. Oops, actually I'm going to add the tomato reserve juice from the can or the sauce. Going to add that right in here too. And now at this point this needs to cook for a little while. We cook it for about 30 minutes or so, after which time we are going to add some beans to it and our pasta, and we'll be done at that point. At this point, as you just finish all this, you could add dried beans to the soup at this point if you have it. If you do use dry beans, you would put them in now after you rinse them, of course. Put them in now. You'll probably have to extend your cooking time a few maybe 30 minutes or so. Just do it at a slow simmer and you'll be fine. Or you can skip that part, add the canned beans, and we're actually going to add some cannellini beans in just a little while to finish off our soup. If you want to use meat in your soup, you can certainly add it at this point too. We're doing a veggie soup, so we're not going to, but certainly I've seen everything from ground beef to chicken to shredded chicken to sausage to pork to whatever you want can go in this soup. As I mentioned, this was a soup that was supposed to be extremely hearty and was a meal in itself. And that, by definition, means you got to have a lot of stuff into it. So we're going to take a few minutes and we'll let this cook, and then when we come back, we'll be ready to finish it off. All right, it's time. We got a nice boil going on there. It's been cooking for a while, and we're just about ready to finish it off. But before we do that, just like with the Italian wedding soup, let me tell you a little bit about minestrone and where that came from, and how that has been a big part of European culture, if you will, for a very long time. Minestrone means big soup to Italians, and essentially it's a soup with a lot of stuff in it. As you can tell from how we prepped, there is quite a few veggies in here. It actually originated, however, from minestra, which means to dish up or serve. But that's how we got to minestrone today. There's a beautiful thing about minestrone, I think, is there's no wrong way to do it. This is a recipe that you will find a minestrone in various points of the country very, very different. Some use a lighter base in their stocks, like more chicken, others or vegetables. Some of them use a much deeper, all beef. You know, whatever vegetables are in season is what you're going to find in the soup. So it is a dish that originally was not made in and of itself. In other words, this is often what they would use all their leftovers for. So at the end of a week or whenever, they'd put everything that they had left into this soup and create a meal out of it. So it had a very humble beginning, as many soups and stews do, but it was definitely intended for everyday consumption because it was very inexpensive. You have stuff left over, you put it in a pan, you add some great stuff to it, and you're good to go. As I said, it's neither a fixed recipe, or you may not even find it similar. You might find a minestrone in the south that you wouldn't even identify as a minestrone in the north. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you about that? I think that's about it as far as minestrone goes. So we have the bay leaf, and this is an herb or a spice. I'm not sure which one. I think it's probably a cross between both, given it's a leaf, that really has to be dried in order to be used. When you pick them fresh, the flavor is very subtle. When you dry them, it intensifies. And in fact, you leave them whole. And the reason you leave them whole is because it's not very pleasant. It's a very rough texture. And if you were to crush it up and put it in your soup, literally it could scrape your esophagus as it went down. So it is not something you want to leave in there. So why do you leave it whole? It's nice and easy to pull it out when you're done. I'm going to let it finish up right in there at the moment. But that is a bay leaf. And what a bay leaf actually is it is the leaf of a bay laurel plant. And it's, as I said, the fresh leaves are very mild and don't really develop any flavor or full flavor until several weeks after they're picked. It's been cultivated since the beginning of recorded history. And the laurel tree from which it comes is very important, both symbolically and literally in Greece and Roman times. It is a central component in many ancient mythologies that glorify the tree as a symbol of honor. They are one of the most widely used culinary herbs in Europe and in North America. And one of the kind of cool thing I found out is in the Elizabethan era, which I probably should know when that is, but I don't. It was a long time ago. Some people actually believed pinning bay leaves to one's pillow on the eve of St. Valentine's Day would permit one to see their future spouse in a dream. So, I don't know if it's true or not, never tried it. I'm quite happily attached. But if you aren't and you want to find out what they look like, pin some bay leaves to your pillow on the 13th of February, which is coming up just right around the corner. And you may find out exactly what's going to happen for you. As I mentioned, the leaves are most used whole. They can be crushed and put into a bouquet garni, which is a variety of herbs and spices that are put into a cheesecloth bundle, so they can then be removed. It can be ground and as well, but again, very strong when you do things like that. You got to be very careful. Best bet, do it the way we've been doing it for a long time. And then the final thing I want to tell you about bay leaves, they can also be scattered in your pantry to repel meal moths, flies, roaches, and silverfish. So they are quite the versatile product. All right, it's time. The last finishing touch for our minestrone is the pasta. You don't have to have pasta in it. It really does help bring a heartiness to the soup, of course, more so even than having all the veggies in there. But the key to pasta in a soup is that you do not want to add it unless you're going to eat that soup that day. If I was to add all the pasta to this soup right now and let it sit, and don't finish the soup and let it sit in the refrigerator, there's two things that are going to happen. Number one, the pasta is going to be like nya-nya, for lack of a better word. It's just going to get soft and mushy, probably kind of disintegrate in the soup, which you don't want. And the second thing is, the yeasts and the flours and things like that, depending on what kind of pasta you use, will tend to make the soup spoil faster. So my suggestion, if you don't think you're going to eat all the soup, then in fact, don't add the pasta. I always cook my pasta separately. I don't cook it in the soup, and that's what I've done here. I have about this is actually about a quarter pound. I have the rest out back, but I started with about a half a pound of a dry orzo. You can use any pasta that's little, a ditalini or a tubatini, anything that's small goes well with this, again, because all your veggies are small. And I've cooked some here. And the way I like to serve it when I'm not sure how much I'm going to use is to take a little bit of that pasta and put it in each of the bowls. So I'm going to take however much I want, put it in the bowl, and I'm going to ladle the rest right on top of it. And that way I know this pasta anyway is going to be eaten. Oh, look at all that wonderful stuff in there. We have remember we have butternut squash. We have the beans I added just a little bit ago. I'm going to turn that off for the moment. And now we have our pasta. And as you can tell, potentially, from looking at it here, it is very hearty. The pasta I did put in cold. The heat of the soup will take care of that immediately. You don't have to worry about that. And all we do now is grab a big loaf of Italian bread, maybe sprinkle on some cheese, and then take a taste. And that's what I'm going to do. Yes. Okay. So, as I mentioned, the secret ingredient, that Worcestershire sauce, you can taste that right in the back of your mouth. And the tomatoes that we put in here and that little bit of tomato sauce just really bring this all together. So, there you have it. Easy minestrone. It's the way to start. You can go all kinds of places once you have this basic recipe in hand. And I believe that actually is the end of our show today. Hopefully by now you've got 2 more great winter soups or any time of the year soups to put into your repertoire of cooking. The beautiful thing, as I mentioned, is there's no wrong way to do either of these. So enjoy. Don't forget, of course, I'll say it one more time. Cook with love. You'll definitely know the difference.